If we have a government of people who all speak the same way, maybe we should be questioning that.
Did you get a chance to watch some of the footy yesterday?
Sorry, gosh.
Oh my gosh.
Well, actually, I
have friends who are upper class, I have friends who are, working class, but I'm not working class.
Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, has recently come out with some comments about how his parents put him into extra drama lessons to help him speak properly and to avoid racist bullying at school for having an accent. You can probably tell by the air quotes which parts of that I think are problematic, and we're going to explore each of those things in turn. You might know that I have a master's in philosophy. I've mentioned it a few times on this channel. I feel like it helps people not assume that I'm just talking absolute rubbish in these videos, but actually my BA was in linguistics. Anytime there's a new story like this about how languages, or English in particular, is changing, how people are using language these days, I always want to comment on it. And that's exactly what I did yesterday when I saw this news article popping up about Rishi Sunak. I went onto my personal Instagram and just started typing out these really long captions on some of my stories. And then I thought, I've already kind of written a whole essay on my Instagram stories, so I might as well just turn it into a video and share it with the people, Language is one of these integral building blocks to identity, whether that's gender identity or racial identity or class identity. In the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language, it's written that the linguistic signals we unwittingly transmit about ourselves every moment of our waking day are highly distinctive and discriminating. More than anything else, language shows we belong, providing the most natural badge or symbol of public and private identity. People, and you included, assuming you're a person, make a lot of assumptions about who you are, where you come from, what type of person you are, even things like morality, based on how you speak.
You don't sound like a Fed. What, I can't emigrate? It's a giant green slapper with her ass in the harbour that says different.
Class, gender, geography, race, religion, and by association, things like wealth and power and privilege can all be assumed just from the very first few seconds of listening to someone talk.
Cousin James.
Why is he making that funny noise? He's English, Ola. That's the way they talk.
So if we're not aware of this or aware of the power dynamics at play, then that means that we might unwittingly perpetuate stereotypical or misinformed ideas of language and make judgments about the value of someone or the value of something that they're saying just based on how they're saying it or the way in which they are communicating.
Right.
What did he say?
And that's why when I saw this headline, I was like, this can't be something that I don't comment on. There is so much at play here because Rishi Sunak, to start off with, he is a conservative, which means that he is likely to have certain conservative views about language and about what it means to speak properly or to write properly or to use language in the correct ways, because that is inherently associated with conservatism. But he's also incredibly rich, and that will become relevant later on when we talk about exactly what that's meant for how he's grown up and all these things.
It's not just about the money.
Him and his wife are worth over £700 million. That is twice the worth of King Charles, the King of England.
I've always been a completely normal UK taxpayer.
You weren't even looking at how much it costs to fill up your card.
I saw that you flew to Blackpool Airport today on a private jet instead of travelling by train, obviously when there's a climate emergency and using taxpayers' money.
And just by virtue of him being in that position and having so much influence and power by being the Prime Minister of the country, he has a lot of influence over how people perceive things like language, regional accents, the accents of people who aren't native British, who came here as refugees or as migrants and speak English as a second language, for example. So he could do a lot of harm or a lot of good for public understanding of how issues like the way people speak are used for things like hate and discrimination. So let's get into it. We're going to break down this interview piece little by little and discuss all of the comments and why they are problematic from a linguistic standpoint.
Personally wouldn't be sitting here supporting Boris if I thought he was racist. So it's something I care very deeply about.
I went all in for this, you guys. I basically just pretended I was back at uni. I dug out all of my old English language and linguistics textbooks, so the Cambridge Encyclopedias of Language and of English Language, and English Language Description, Variation and Context. So the title and the tagline of this article: Rishi Sunak says his parents wanted him to speak without an accent to fit in. PM says he experienced racism as a child and that his parents sent him for extra drama lessons so that he could speak properly. Even in this couple of sentences, there's a lot to unpack. The idea that there is a right and a wrong way to speak is something that a lot of people inherently agree with, even if it's just on a subconscious level.
Right, you're not doing it the way he speaks.
And it's similar with the idea that some people have an accent and other people have no accent. The idea that there are people who don't have an accent is just outright false for a start, but the idea that there are correct and right and proper ways of speaking is sort of down to how you view language and how you think it should be approached. Let me set the scene first so that we know who we're actually dealing with, like what kind of family was Rishi born into, what kind of school did he go to, who was he trying to fit in with, because that's quite relevant, right?
As I always say, I don't judge people by how much money they have in their bank account.
Do you work in a business? Do you want some fruit?
I'm homeless.
So let's have a look at Rishi's Wikipedia page. I can't believe I just said that. I typed into Google Wikipedia, Rishi. Rishi Sunak was born on the same day as me. He has my birthday, the 12th of May, so it's a really good start. Rishi was born in Southampton to parents of Indian descent who immigrated to Britain from East Africa in the 1960s. He attended Stroud School, which is a prep school in Romsey, and later studied at Winchester College as a day boy, becoming head boy of the college. And then he went on to read philosophy, politics and economics at Lincoln College, Oxford, graduating in 2001, and then he went on to do a Master of Business Administration at Stanford, and then he worked for Goldman Sachs, which is an investment bank, and then went into politics, and now he's the Prime Minister. I skipped a whole bunch of his history there, but the things that are kind of the most important is the parents that he was born to. His father was born in Kenya and raised in Kenya, and he's a GP in the NHS, and his mother was born in Tanzania and is a pharmacist, and she also had a degree. Both of his parents were university educated, but they were from outside of the UK. They weren't native English, white English. So when we talk about his time at school and his parents and his family, we know that they were relatively well off. They had their own business, their own pharmacy. Both of his parents were university educated, and they were able to send him to private schools, which is a really key point. That helped to set him up for the rest of his education and his career, ultimately.
What are we? A leading single-sex school admitting boarders at age 11.
For context, about 30% of the people accepted to Oxford come from private schools, even though only 0.6% of children who go to school in the UK actually go to a private school rather than a state school. That is an average cost of £15,000 a year per child. The average disposable income of a household was 32k in 2022. So the average household would have to spend half of their wages to send just one of their kids to school for just 1 year.
You shake the hand of the head girl.
Out of respect.
When the head girl has earned my respect, then I'll shake her hand, biatch.
This article from last year says pupils in private school are more than twice as likely to achieve A to A-star grades as those in the state sector, according to official figures that expose a widening attainment gap in education in England after more than 13 years of Conservative government. That's the same Conservative government that Rishi is now at the head of.
Started making it, had a breakdown. Bon appetit.
Research in 2014 by the Sutton Trust had some really interesting findings about where people end up when they go to state school versus private school. So they found that a disproportionate number of the highest paid jobs go to people who are educated privately. For example, 3/4 of the top judges in the UK were privately educated. And they also found that students from the most advantaged backgrounds in the UK were 7 times more likely to get into one of the UK's top 30 universities than students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So why does this matter? Like, why have I given you all of this context? Well, because this is the environment that Rishi's parents wanted him to fit in to. The schools he went to are in Romsey and Winchester, which are in the south part of England, if you don't already know. And to give you a sense of what kind of places these are, Romsey was described by The Guardian as resoundingly timelessly English in 2014, and the newspaper was also remarking on the town's representation of bourgeois provincial life. So Rishi would have been surrounded by southern children from southern families who were very well off.
Are you sure? I mean, it's a bit of a faff wheeling you back to college.
This is where sociolinguistics comes in, because now we can talk about what it means for Rishi to fit into this context and to speak properly within this context and to speak without an accent. First off, there's no such thing as speaking without an accent, as I mentioned earlier. This is a misconception based on the fact that one particular way of speaking, one particular accent in Britain has been taken to be the most standard, the most correct, and the most proper one. To believe in the first place that there is a correct way to speak and to write is called prescriptivism. David Crystal writes for the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language that language belongs to everyone, so most people feel they have a right to hold an opinion about it. And when opinions differ, emotions run high. Arguments can flare as easily over minor points of usage as over major policies of linguistic planning and education. Linguistic factors influence our judgments of personality, intelligence, social status, educational standards, job aptitude, and many other areas of identity and social survival. As a result, it's easy to hurt and to be hurt when language use is unfeelingly attacked. To take a prescriptive mindset is to say that one variety of language is an inherently higher value than others, and that this ought to be imposed on the whole of the speech community. And that favoured variety is used as the standard to measure all other varieties of the language against. If you're speaking in line with that standard, then you are doing it correctly, you're speaking properly, but if you're deviating from it, then you're doing it incorrectly. Prescriptivism used to be the way that linguistics sort of worked until the latter half of the 18th century, but then linguists realized that actually it's more useful to just study how language is actually used, how people actually speak, so the facts of how English is actually used, rather than trying to tell people that how they're speaking is wrong and swim against this tide of changing language, because language is always changing. So this idea that there was once this perfect form of English that we should all be speaking and writing and everyone should be speaking and writing the same and the language should never change is just absolutely ridiculous. There was never a point in time that you could pinpoint to be like, this is when English was perfect and nothing should ever change from that point. Every single day, every single sentence adds something to how language is used.
That's that. So, whiskey.
It's not hard to see how these two perspectives of prescriptivism and the opposite of describing just how people actually use language, which is called descriptivism, map quite neatly onto the different political ideologies of conservatism and liberalism, because conservatism is all about conserving how things used to be, or conserving certain traditional values or certain right and proper ways of doing things, whereas liberals are a bit more like, you know, everyone uses language in a different way, everyone has different ways of doing things, and like maybe that's okay. And actually everyone, literally everyone, has a different, distinct way of speaking. If you want a fancy word for it, it's called an idiolect. So to go back to the idea of a standard form of the English language, we can talk about two things. We could talk about dialect and we could talk about accent. Dialect is the words that people use in different parts of the country and how they use certain grammatical structures and this kind of thing. So it's what they actually say, whereas accent is more how they say it and how it sounds when it actually leaves their mouths. So dialect variation, for example, can be found in things like how a bread roll is said to be a different thing in different parts of the country. As for accents, you're probably familiar with or able to distinguish between things like an American accent or an Australian accent or a Scottish accent or a Welsh accent, because they all sound different.
Being at home doing nothing, it just passes the time.
And if my ma starts asking questions,
Your mum won't trace it back to us.
are you for real? She traces everything back to us.
Disgusting!
In Britain, for example, the word bath or bath is pronounced differently in different parts of the country. So typically in southern regions, people tend to say bath as it rhymes with father, but in more northern parts of the country, people say bath as in rhyming with cat. The standard dialect in English is just standard English, which is kind of the written form of a language, and the standard accent is sort of what you would hear on BBC News, for example.
It's 6:30, it's Friday the 14th of October. Let's tell you what's coming up on the programme.
It's often said to be received pronunciation, which is like the Queen's English and sort of what the royal family speak.
It's no surprise that families so often treasure their Christmas routines.
But actually, since the 1980s, we're seeing that a form of the English accent called estuary English is spreading from around London. It's a little bit more relaxed, it's less sort of elitist, so the middle classes were starting to use it as a way to kind of distance themselves from any kind of elitism and that upper class sort of like poshness and like snobbery aspect. So the only people that actually sort of use received pronunciation are kind of the royal family and like lords and ladies, whereas the sort of the BBC News accent, which is what I kind of like to call it, is more that sort of slightly cockney, like southern London accent.
Then we take a little bit of butter and then just put a thin layer of pancake batter in there, move it around like that.
The problem is that, as linguist Kevin Watson puts it, by equating the rules of English and clean, correct sentences with standard English, it's implied that dialects of English, because they are non-standard, are unclean and ungrammatical. By association, the people speaking them are seen as uneducated or unprofessional.
Okay, the date and she was pregnant the same time she was pregnant.
Are you starting to see why our politicians talk more like a BBC News presenter and less like, you know, the Arctic Monkeys?
He like wrote the string arrangement for like Cornerstone and Mardyman.
The key thing to understand in relation to Rishi Sunak's comments is that the standard version of language is always associated with the higher social class, whereas the non-standard forms of English are associated with the lower social class. If you are working class, then you are much more likely to speak with a regional accent and use a regional dialect, rather than conforming to the standard English way of speaking.
She doesn't look like an English teacher. She looks like she ain't got a pot to piss in. Sorry, Miss Britton. She doesn't look like she's got a pot in which to piss.
Then for the upper classes, it's the opposite. They're much more likely to speak in this standard English way. This is Trudgill's model of social class and language variation, which is summarized in these neat pyramids. So who was Rishi trying to fit in with at school? The people who speak standard English and receive pronunciation or estuary English, the standard version of English, which is therefore associated with being more educated and higher class. And since he is non-white, and since this whole story is about racist bullying at school, we should also add that the type of language, the type of English that he was trying to fit in with was white standard English, as opposed to speaking with a dialect or with an accent that would betray that he belonged somewhere else other than in this higher class, highly educated, posher context. Being lower class or being identifiably non-British would mean him not fitting in to that context of the schools that he was going to. There's so much variation in how people speak English, even within Britain, but even more so on a global scale.
What are the people gonna be screaming when Jamaica takes the hill? Let's see, we call it Cool Running.
To say that there is a correct or right or proper way of using and speaking English when that correct, proper, right way really neatly matches how rich white people use the language, you can see where the problems arise. And clearly Rishi also struggled with this at school, and it's the reason why he wasn't fitting in. If he could make himself sound more like the people around him, then he had a better chance of climbing up the education and the career ladder. Let's read some more of the article then. Rishi Sunak has spoken about the racism he experienced as a child and how his parents were so determined he should fit in and speak without an accent that he was sent for extra drama lessons. "You're conscious of being different," he told the deputy political editor of the ITV News, Anushka Asthana. "It's hard not to be, right? And obviously I experienced racism as a kid." I don't want to dismiss the forms of bullying that Rishi experienced at school. Clearly there were some obstacles that he had to overcome to get where he is, but privilege comes in many sorts of forms. And I would argue that due to Rishi's family wealth and the fact that both his parents were university educated, he was able to turn himself into this very palatable, conservative, British, higher class person, and to sound the part as well. And now he's turning around and using this language of a proper way to talk or speaking without an accent as if these are things that are basic facts and truths that exist in the world, rather than things that are founded on the unequal idea that one group of people are doing it right and everyone else is doing it wrong. He was conscious of being different, and his parents got him out of that situation by putting him into drama lessons. I have questions about these drama lessons. Were they outside of school? So were his parents paying extra for them? Was this a free club, or was it provided by the school, which is sort of more likely, in which case they were still paying for them because he went to private school? Because of his parents' wealth, he was able to go to these lessons and to learn to speak properly, and therefore get rid of one of the qualities that would sort of qualify him as a target for bullying at school. He got out because of the money, essentially. But what about every other kid or everyone in the country right now who speaks with a regional accent or with an accent because English isn't their first language, who don't have the money to learn to speak properly? Because Rishi is an exception to this trend that most people who speak with a non-standard accent are lower class. But most people speaking non-standard English today do identify as being lower class, being working class. So he's saying to them that yes, there is a correct way of speaking, and completely alienating, let's be honest, a big part of his voter population. We're talking about people like refugees or migrants or people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are working class, who tend to have very localized accents or very strong accents.
It's just going through a bit of a weird patch at the moment, isn't it? You know what I mean? It's like, you know.
In fact, this story sort of makes it seem like he's trying to get people who are non-white or working class to sort of empathize with him.
I'm a coke addict, total coke addict.
And to think of him as one of them because he suffered with the same kinds of bullying or racism that they might have experienced in school or that their kids might experience in school. But most other people don't have the opportunities that his parents had to just kind of teach him how to do it properly. Most other people couldn't just change the things about themselves that signaled that they are anything other than educated and professional and high class and white.
It is immoral.
If we read on in the article, it says that Sunak recalled the pain of hearing slurs directed at his younger siblings, adding that racism stings and hurts in a way that other things don't. He felt that what he experienced would not happen to his children now. And this is a further point that we should explore a little bit because it again shows how out of touch he is. He said that he felt that this type of racism would not happen to his children now. But in 2020, a survey commissioned by the Diana Award, an anti-bullying organisation, revealed that 1/3 of children in the UK have heard racist comments at school, and nearly 1 in a quarter said they noticed a rise in racist bullying just before and during the lockdowns. Plus, in 2021, The Guardian reported that were 60,000 racist incidents in British schools between 2016 and 2021. That's just the ones that were reported, I'm assuming. The government also released a really highly criticised report in 2021, which said that institutionalised racism in schools was a thing of the past and that schools weren't racist anymore. And it was saying that we need to be looking at social economic class and social deprivation rather than at race now, despite the fact that race and class are really closely connected, but a lot of people had a lot of issues with that. So it doesn't seem like racism is gone from schools, sadly, Rishi. The fact is that kids today will continue to be bullied for being different, being non-standard, and will continue to grow up to go into situations where they are then discriminated against or have incorrect assumptions made about them based on how they use the English language, whether it's because English is not their first language or because they speak with a particular regional accent. The fact that Rishi grew up, went to Oxford, and then learned to behave and speak in the same way as every Tory politician doesn't really do a lot to show us that people of all ethnicities, of different minority backgrounds and heritage can go on to take on positions of power like the Prime Minister's office. Obviously, he's held on to the colour of his skin and certain things, and people will praise his election as a sign of how progressive the UK is and how racism is gone from the UK, but he's actually not very representative of the people that live in the UK.
People feel that you can't walk a mile in their shoes because you're walking in your Prada shoes.
He is still spewing the same conservative agenda. He went to the same schools, he went to the same clubs, he was part of the same circles as his other white conservative mates. And this is why this story really highlights that diversity in terms of just skin colour is not enough. We need diversity in positions of power that stems across ideologies and lived experiences rather than just looking at who's black and who's white and who's brown. And that diversity is likely to be seen in the way that people speak. If we have a government of people who all speak the same way, then maybe we should question why.